In this video, we want to talk about the carbon balance sheet and the carbon investment portfolio. And this can be for individuals or it can be for businesses. So everyone has a carbon balance sheet. I have a carbon balance sheet, you have one, your business has one. What does it look like? So the idea of the carbon balance sheet for me as an individual or for a business is all of the carbon that you've emitted over the period of your life. So in my case, since I was born, in the case of a business, since it was launched, since inception. Every year, you're responsible for certain emissions. Depending on where you are in the world, they can be higher emissions or lower emissions. For example, when I grew up in Australia, because the energy sector there uses predominantly coal, my per capita emissions were higher when I was living in Australia than I am living here in Switzerland, where they predominantly use well, not predominantly, but they use a large amount of hydroelectricity, which has a lot lower carbon footprint. So depending on where you live or depending on where your business is, every year you'll generate, just by being, a certain amount of carbon emissions. Of course, on top of that, then there's all of the things that you use, the things that you do. So as an individual, the food that I eat has an impact. Carbon footprint of meat products is much higher than, for example, a vegetarian or a vegan. If I fly a lot, I'm putting a lot of carbon up into the atmosphere. If I drive my car everywhere, I put a lot of carbon up into the atmosphere. So the idea is to try and work out, without getting too complex, without making it too difficult, what that carbon footprint is. And for an individual, it's a lot easier than for a business. So for an individual, on the site there, you'll see that we've put a little map, and you can actually do a calculation of how many years you've lived in certain countries. I always add 20% on the end of that just to sort of boost it up, because you want to make sure that if it's not an overestimate, that it's certainly not an underestimate. So there's a little text there on the side of how you do that, and that becomes your liability for each year. And then you can go all the way back to, in my case, 1964 when I was born, and that becomes my total carbon liability. That's on the left-hand side. It's like in a ledger in an accounting system. Then on the right-hand side, I want to start looking at the activities that I can do to address that carbon misbalance, all those emissions that are out there. If you're a business, it's more complex, because not only are you consuming energy, for example, where you have your office, then there's all of the carbon that's embedded in the things that you use, the paper that you buy. If you're a business that makes products, in the what they call Scope 3 emissions, all of the emissions that are embedded in the things, the raw materials that you bring in to make your products, or the things you use to make your services. And traditionally, that's really a bit complex to calculate. People pay large amounts of money, or businesses pay large amounts of money to get expensive consultants to come and work that out for them. We don't recommend you do that as a first step. Not a bad idea to have it, because ultimately you do need a number over here on this part of your ledger. But there's so much money and so much effort put into calculating this information, and most people just do it for 1 year. They don't go back to the life of the organisation. And not enough on actions. And we're very much focused here at My Carbon Zero on actions. We want you to act. So those calculations can come later, because you can be sure you've got a footprint. So that brings us to the other side of the ledger. This is where we have to have actions, where we want to put the things that you're doing, the R1, R2, and R3 actions that we describe in other videos and also here on the site, what you can do to start dealing with that number that's on the left-hand side of your ledger. So every year you add a certain amount of carbon. So the R1 actions are how you reduce the amount of carbon that you add every year to that big pile that you've created since your birth or since your inception. You'll never get that down to zero, because you'll always be emitting some carbon. You know, you can maybe using your hydroelectricity, you're using renewable electricity, but just the food you buy, there's always the clothes you wear, there's always a carbon footprint. And so that's where R2 emissions come in. How do we invest in projects elsewhere to reduce carbon emissions there, so that we can try and, that small amount that we have, that residual amount we have of our R1 emissions, our own emissions, we can actually start lowering those down somewhere else. So that's R2. That's great to reduce the amount of carbon you put in the atmosphere every year, but we need to deal with all of this carbon that's sitting over there. And that's what we talk about with R3. So there's other videos about that, there's other text about that. I'm not going to explain in great details what R1, R2, and R3 actions are here, but that's what you put on this side of the ledger. And you'll see that if you want to join our My Carbon Zero community, we provide tools and guidance in the community about how you can set up your carbon balance sheet to start accounting, working out what your liabilities are and what you can do to reduce the annual amount that you emit into the atmosphere and get those liabilities out of the atmosphere and get your balance down to zero. So I encourage you to join the community. There's buttons at the bottom of the page where you can do that. Sign up and you get access to all of our guidance and our advice and our support. So thanks very much for that.